Rent reminders had become a kind of background noise in Daniel's life, but this time the pressure was crushing. He sat hunched at his desk in the small London flat, scrolling through invoices that remained unpaid and watching numbers that refused to add up. The glow of his laptop reflected in his tired eyes, emphasizing the weight of every overdue bill. He had never imagined that freelancing as a graphic designer would feel like drowning with no one reaching out a hand. His boyfriend Michael was in the other room, tie loosened after a long day at the bank, sipping a glass of scotch while staring blankly at the television. Michael's world seemed so stable, so secure, structured hours, steady paychecks, colleagues who respected him. Daniel admired that solidity but also resented how unreachable it felt. They had been together for nearly 5 years, but lately their home resembled two parallel lives that touched only in the kitchen or the bedroom, and even then, sparingly. The knock came just after 8. Daniel flinched, his chest tightening as if the sound itself demanded money he didn't have. He opened the door to find Edward, the landlord, standing in the dim hallway light. Edward was tall, in his early 40s, with a calm composure that felt almost intimidating. His dark coat was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished, and his expression neither cruel nor kind, simply measured. "Daniel," Edward said, voice low but steady. "You're late again. 2 months now." Daniel swallowed, words tumbling over one another. I know. Work has been slow, but I'm chasing clients. I just need a little more time." Edward studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You have 1 week. After that, I'll have no choice but to take action." His tone carried no anger, only certainty. Yet beneath it, there was something else Daniel couldn't quite name, a quiet intensity that unsettled him. When the door shut, Daniel leaned back against it, exhaling as though he'd been holding his breath for hours. He walked into the living room, where Michael barely glanced up. "Who was that?" Michael asked, eyes fixed on the screen. "Edward," Daniel muttered. "The rent." Michael sighed, setting down his glass with a sharp clink. "You promised me last month this wouldn't happen again. Do you want me to just cover everything?" The word stung, not because of the offer but because of the tone. It wasn't generosity, it was exhaustion. Daniel shook his head. "I'll figure it out." "I don't want you carrying all of it." "Then figure it out quickly," Michael said, attention already drifting back to the glowing screen. That night, lying in bed beside Michael, Daniel stared at the ceiling, listening to the shallow rhythm of his partner's breathing. He thought about the man he used to know, the one who once left notes in his sketchbook, the one who planned spontaneous trips to the seaside. That man seemed gone, replaced by someone who measured life in deadlines and bonuses. Daniel's chest tightened, not only from the rent notice but from the aching emptiness of being unseen. The week passed in a blur of unanswered emails, polite rejections, and an ever-deepening pit in his stomach. On the 7th day, desperation pressed harder than pride. He found himself standing at Edward's door, rehearsing pleas for an extension. Edward opened almost immediately, as though expecting him. The flat behind him looked nothing like Daniel's cluttered apartment, sleek furniture, muted colors, every detail perfectly placed. Edward didn't invite him in, only leaned against the frame, watching him with that same steady composure. "I know I said I'd have the rent," Daniel began, voice trembling. "But I don't. Not yet. If you could just give me a little more time," Edward interrupted softly, almost kindly. "There are other ways to settle what's owed." Daniel blinked, the words hanging heavy in the air. He searched Edward's face for clarification, but the landlord's expression revealed nothing except an unwavering calm. His heart began to pound, not with fear alone but with something more complicated: curiosity, confusion, a spark of temptation he wished he didn't feel. "Don't understand," Daniel stammered. "You will," Edward replied, his tone deliberate. "Think about it. I'll be waiting." Daniel left without agreeing, but his mind wouldn't stop circling the possibility. That night, lying once again beside Michael, he felt the silence between them like a wall. Michael's arm draped across him mechanically, a gesture without warmth. Daniel's thoughts drifted back to Edward's voice, the insinuation in his words, the steadiness in his eyes. "If Michael really loved me, Daniel whispered into the darkness, he'd see me. He'd save me. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message lit up the screen. From Edward, think about it. I'll be waiting. Daniel closed his eyes, knowing his life had just shifted towards something he couldn't yet name. Daniel woke with a pit in his stomach. The morning sun slid across the curtains, but its warmth did nothing to lift the weight pressing down on him. Michael was already gone, leaving only the faint smell of cologne and a cold indentation in the sheets. The silence of the flat felt louder than any argument could. Throughout the day, Daniel tried to drown himself in work, sketching half-formed logos and scrolling through empty inboxes, but Edward's words echoed in his head. There are other ways to settle what's owed. It wasn't just the suggestion, it was the way Edward had looked at him, unflinching, as if he already knew how the story would unfold. That evening, Michael returned, briefcase in hand, face drawn from long hours at the bank. Daniel ventured carefully, hoping for sympathy. I spoke to Edward, he began. Michael raised an eyebrow. And? I asked for more time. Daniel, Michael sighed, placing his case on the table. This can't keep happening. I can't be the only one who takes responsibility. You promised you'd pull your weight. The words struck with the precision of a blade. Daniel wanted to defend himself, to explain how he'd been trying, but exhaustion silenced him. He nodded instead, though inside his resentment swelled. That night, after Michael drifted to sleep, Daniel lay awake, scrolling through his phone. A new message glowed at the top of the screen. My offer still stands. Edward. He stared at it for a long time. His breath quickened, shame battling with temptation. He told himself it wasn't desire, it was survival. He whispered into the darkness, it's just rent. Nothing more. 2 days later, Daniel found himself outside Edward's flat. He stood frozen, palms sweating, rehearsing excuses in case he decided to turn back. But before he could knock, the door opened. Edward stood there, immaculate as ever, his presence filling the hallway. Come in, Edward said simply, stepping aside. Inside, the flat was quiet, the air faintly scented with cedar and wine. Daniel's eyes darted across polished shelves and expensive art, a world so far removed from his own cluttered apartment. Edward poured 2 glasses of red wine, offering one without a word. Daniel accepted, his fingers trembling. I don't do this lightly, Edward began, voice steady. But you seemed desperate. And I don't believe in wasting opportunities. Daniel's throat tightened. So this is, what exactly? A deal, Edward said plainly. Your rent is covered. In return, you give me what I want. No strings, no obligations beyond that. The bluntness stole Daniel's breath. He felt his cheeks burn, every nerve alive with conflict. He could leave, he should leave. But he didn't move. Edward's eyes lingered on him, not with pity, but with a deliberate interest that felt both dangerous and magnetic. When Edward touched his hand, the room seemed to narrow, as if everything outside that moment ceased to exist. Daniel closed his eyes, surrendering not out of romance but out of exhaustion, curiosity, and the faint, painful thrill of being wanted. Later, as he walked home under the streetlights, Daniel's mind swirled with contradictions. He felt lighter, almost exhilarated, yet ashamed. He had crossed a line, and the imprint of Edward's touch clung to him more fiercely than guilt. When he opened the door to the flat, Michael was waiting in the kitchen, reheating leftovers. He smiled faintly when Daniel entered, a smile so ordinary it cut deeper than any confrontation. Michael leaned in to kiss him, and Daniel froze for a fraction of a second before forcing himself to respond. The taste of Edward lingered, and Daniel's stomach twisted. He excused himself quickly, retreating to the bedroom under the pretense of exhaustion. Alone, he pressed his palms to his face, whispering, "What have I done?" But as the days slipped into weeks, the arrangement with Edward continued. Each meeting was a collision of necessity and temptation. Edward offered not just relief from financial pressure but a kind of attention Daniel hadn't felt in years. He listened, he noticed details, how Daniel's hand trembled when he laughed, how his eyes lit up when talking about art. Michael, meanwhile, grew more distant, buried in reports and client dinners. He noticed Daniel's lighter mood but attributed it to freelance luck. "Looks like things are picking up for you," Michael said once, pouring himself another drink. Daniel only smiled faintly, unable to confirm or deny. The duplicity gnawed at him, yet so did the thrill. Every step deeper into Edward's world pulled him further from Michael, and from the man he thought he was. One evening, lying awake again while Michael slept beside him, Daniel realized the truth he had been avoiding: this wasn't only about rent anymore. It was about desire. About being seen. About remembering what it felt like to be wanted, and with that recognition came a new fear, because secrets like these never stayed hidden forever. The secrecy could not last forever. Daniel knew it, yet he clung to the illusion that he could balance both lives, Michael's steady familiarity and Edward's intoxicating attention. For a time, the deception felt manageable. He returned home after nights with Edward, slipping back into the role of partner, cooking dinners, laughing at half-hearted jokes. But cracks began to show, thin at first, then widening with each lie. Michael noticed the changes. Daniel's clothes were sharper, his confidence strangely renewed. Rent was suddenly paid on time, despite Daniel's workload remaining sparse. Even small luxuries appeared: a new jacket, dinners out, things Daniel could never have afforded weeks ago. One evening, as they cleared dishes from the table, Michael asked casually, "So, business must be good lately?" Daniel froze, the plate in his hands slick with soap. He forced a smile. "Yeah, I've had a few new clients." Michael studied him, eyes narrowing. "Strange. You haven't mentioned them." Daniel's throat tightened. He shrugged lightly. "Didn't want to bore you with details." Michael said nothing more, but suspicion had been planted. Days later, while Daniel showered, Michael's curiosity won. He picked up Daniel's phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up with a new message: "Same time tonight?" When Daniel stepped from the bathroom, towel around his waist, Michael was sitting on the edge of the bed, phone in hand. His expression was carved from stone. "Who's Edward?" Michael asked, voice low, steady. Daniel froze, the air gone from his lungs. His first instinct was denial, but the lie caught in his throat. "He's my landlord." Michael's eyes burned. "And what exactly is this 'same time tonight' supposed to mean?" Silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. Daniel's body trembled, and when the words finally came, they carried all the weight of guilt he had tried to bury. "I couldn't pay the rent. He offered me a way out. And I took it." The room erupted, not in shouts, but in something sharper. Michael's voice broke, a mixture of anger and hurt. "You sold us out, Daniel. You didn't trust me enough to come to me, and instead, you..." He stopped, choking on his own rage. Tears blurred Daniel's vision. "I begged you to see me, Michael. You haven't touched me in months, haven't asked how I am. Edward," he noticed. "He made me feel alive again." Michael's face twisted, wounded pride colliding with betrayal. He grabbed his jacket, storming out, leaving the door slamming behind him. Daniel stood in the silence, heart pounding, knowing the fragile world he had built had shattered. That night, he went to Edward's flat, desperate for comfort. Edward welcomed him in with that same calm composure, pouring wine as though nothing had happened. Daniel confessed the confrontation, expecting sympathy, but Edward only leaned back, eyes unreadable. "You knew this would catch up to you," Edward said. "That's not my problem." Daniel stared, realization cutting deeper than any rejection. Edward didn't love him. Edward wanted control, convenience, and Daniel had been willing to sell himself for both survival and a taste of desire. He left before dawn, wandering the empty streets of the city, cold air biting his skin. Alone, he turned inward, forcing himself to confront truths he had avoided. Michael had given him stability, but at the cost of intimacy. Edward had given him passion, but nothing lasting. Both men reflected his own brokenness, his own inability to believe he deserved more than scraps. When he returned to the flat, Michael was asleep on the sofa, tie loosened, a half-empty glass on the table. Daniel paused, watching the man he still loved but no longer recognized. Quietly, he packed a small bag, clothes, his laptop, a sketchbook. Before leaving, he sent Edward a single message: "This deal is over." That he lingered in the doorway one last time, eyes on Michael's sleeping form. Then he stepped out into the night, the sound of the lock clicking behind him both terrifying and liberating. As he walked under the flickering streetlights, he whispered to himself, "I couldn't pay the rent, so I made a deal. But in the end, the real debt was to myself. And it's time I finally pay it." The city stretched endlessly before him, lonely, uncertain, but alive with possibility. The streets of London felt different with a suitcase in hand. Daniel walked without direction, the glow of street lamps stretching shadows across the pavement. Each step carried both dread and freedom, a reminder that he had left behind everything familiar, even if it had been crumbling. That he spent the first nights in a cheap hostel, a space filled with strangers' snores and the scent of stale coffee. Yet in that anonymity, Daniel found a strange sense of relief. Nobody knew him there, nobody asked where Michael was, or why his phone lit up with messages he refused to open. Still, solitude had its sharp edges. At night, when the room grew quiet, his thoughts drifted back to Michael, his steady breathing, his sharp words, the comfort of their routines. He also thought of Edward, his calculated gaze, the thrill of being wanted, the humiliation of being used. Between them stretched a void Daniel had never learned to fill on his own. During the days, Daniel threw himself into work with renewed desperation. He wandered cafes with his sketchbook, pitching to small businesses, offering logos for prices far below his worth. For once, the urgency was his alone, not masked by Michael's paycheck or Edward's proposition. Each modest commission felt like a step toward reclaiming himself, but temptation lingered. Edward's name still flashed across his phone. At first, Daniel ignored it, but one evening, when exhaustion weighed heavier than pride, he opened a message: "You left too soon. I can still take care of you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Daniel's chest tightened. There was no threat in the words, but the calm assumption of ownership unsettled him. Edward didn't ask, Edward expected. For a moment, Daniel considered replying, if only to demand freedom more forcefully. But he set the phone down, choosing silence instead. A week later, as Daniel carried groceries up the steps of his hostel, he spotted a familiar figure waiting by the entrance. Edward leaned casually against the railing, dressed impeccably as always, his presence a sharp contrast to the peeling paint of the building. "Daniel," Edward said smoothly. "We need to talk." Daniel stiffened. "I told you it's over." Edward's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained steady. "You think walking away makes it that simple? You owe me, whether you admit it or not." The words stung, not because they were true, but because part of Daniel still believed them. He clenched the grocery bag until the plastic strained. "I don't owe you anything. Not anymore." For a long moment, Edward studied him, then gave a faint, humorless smile. "We'll see." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel shaken but resolute. That night, Daniel lay awake in the narrow hostel bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. Edward's shadow loomed, but beneath it, another thought stirred: Michael. He had not heard from him since leaving, though he had checked his phone obsessively, waiting for a message that never came. Perhaps Michael was relieved to be free. Perhaps he was hurt beyond repair. Perhaps both. Daniel pressed a hand against his chest, whispering to himself, "I need to learn how to live without needing to be saved." The words felt strange, fragile, but true. In the morning, he decided to move forward. He found a small studio apartment, bare walls, a broken heater, but it was his. He painted the first canvas he had touched in months, colors bleeding across the frame like unspoken confessions. For the first time in a long while, the creation wasn't for money, wasn't for Edward's approval or Michael's indifference. It was for himself. Yet even in that fragile new beginning, uncertainty lingered. Would Edward truly let go? Would Michael reappear? Or would Daniel finally stand on his own, no matter how unsteady the ground beneath him? He sat on the floor of the studio, brush in hand, the city's hum filtering through the thin windows. His phone vibrated beside him. He didn't pick it up. Not yet. Instead, he dipped the brush into a streak of deep blue, whispering, "This time, I choose me." And though the path ahead remained uncertain, the first stroke across the canvas felt like a promise he intended to keep.